there from Maria. So crowding, reducing stress, microbiome and Dorian. So that is something I don't have time to cover today. There has been some really interesting experimental research on contact with nature and improvements to microbiome. If that's something that's particularly interesting to people, I'll try and dig out some references for you as well. Avoiding screen time, interesting, Chris, there. So yeah, again, lots of the study findings I'm going to cover today can't necessarily compare, for example, the effects of mental health versus things like screen time, because, for example, the surveys on nature connection don't necessarily ask about screen time all the time. So more exercise, pollution, nervous system regulation is an interesting one from Christina. So we do have lots of evidence now about parasympathetic nervous system activation and nature. Yes. And then some of you are drawing on yesterday's findings around biodiversity and bird sounds, absolutely. And then more general things like beautiful views and aesthetics, etc. So again, there's been an awful lot of studies on preference and on visual and scenic beauty in natural environments as well. Not something I can cover in detail. Great, thank you for all your contributions. Well, hopefully what you're going to see is some of your ideas there in the chat echoed in these coming slides. And hopefully you'll gain a sense of some of the kind of common threads between how nature can impact our health and well-being through different mechanisms. So the first set of mechanisms we're going to focus on is mitigating harms. So the ability of nature to mitigate our exposure to air pollution, to noise pollution, and to extreme heats as well. So that's where we are in the diagram. We're going to talk about types, qualities, and availability of nature, how it might mitigate harms, and how that might lead through to better health and well-being. So let's talk about air pollution, one of the kind of biggest environmental health risks of our time. And most of the research on green space and air pollution is interested in these pretty prevalent different pollutants, so particulate matter, so that's particles less than 10 or 2.5 micrometers in length. They're small enough to penetrate our lungs and cause different respiratory diseases amongst other problems. The main source of particulate matter is road traffic emissions, especially diesel vehicles. Also nitrogen oxide or NO2, nitrogen dioxide, often originating from burning fossil fuels. And sulfur dioxide is often used in power generation and shipping. So most of the studies you see will target or look at one of these three groups of pollutants. So the question is, how does green space reduce air pollution? Well, there's two different ways in which that might occur. The first is what I call the confounding pathway. In other words, if there's more green space, then there's less room for stuff that generates pollution. So that's the kind of confounding pathway. So if there's more green space, there's less room for other stuff really that can generate these harms. I suppose the more interesting one from our perspective today is the causal pathway. So in other words, does more green space capture or sort of disrupt the connection between airborne gaseous particulate and aerosol pollutants, reduce their concentration in the air, and therefore protect us from those potentially risky health impacts of air pollution? And within that kind of causal pathway, there's two further kind of things that might happen. The first is deposition. So for example, I have lots of trees or bushes on a tree-lined street, and the leaf surfaces capture those pollutants and stop them ever getting to my nose or my throat. Or it could be indirect. So if I've got lots of trees and vegetation, they alter the atmospheric turbulence around my particular city, or they might affect wind flow, which means that air pollutants get redirected to places where people aren't. So deposition and dispersion are the two main sort of mechanisms by which green space might cause us to be less exposed to air pollution. So as you might imagine, the relationship between green space and air pollution is very complicated, and it's highly design and context dependent on the kind of place that you're talking about. So there's various kinds of research has suggested that, for example, woodlands may be better than grasslands at mitigating air pollution because of the increased leaf surfaces. Conifer trees might be better than deciduous trees. Cypress trees might be better than pine trees. Canopy density, tree density, crown height, leaf density, tree height, all of these different factors have been shown to be influential in one way or another in terms of mitigating or reducing the impact of air pollution. So there's no kind of one-size-fits-all solution to this is what you should do in your particular context if you want to buffer people's exposure to air pollution with natural solutions. However, if you do want some very crude answers about the health impacts of this study, for example, again in the UK, modelled increasing tree cover in the West Midlands region. This was a kind of realistic scenario of increase, so they took all the land that could be realistically used for tree planting. So that would have gone from about 4% of the total area to around 16.5%. And that was associated with reduced particulate matter concentrations of around 10%. They reckon that most of that is caused by a predicted 19% increase in deposition on leaf surfaces. So again, this kind of increase, or for about 12.5% of tree cover, was associated with around 10% reduction in particulate matter. But again, context matters. So in the very same research paper, they also modelled the impacts of Glasgow, and that was only associated with a 2% reduction in the concentration of PM10. And one of the kind of things that has been more consistently shown is that when you have these kind of street canyon type environments, so you kind of imagine like New York City or something like that, with sky-rise buildings either side of the street, what you find is that things like low-level hedges and green facades or green roofs or green walls are more effective than trees at actually mitigating exposure to air pollution. And again, it's purely what they think is because of the increase in leaf surfaces as well. So especially at ground level, if you have more bushes, then exhaust pipe emissions are often caught on the leaf surfaces of those bushes, which stop them ever reaching humans' noses or throats, if you like. Well, not entirely, of course, but yeah, to a certain extent. There's very similar patterns, actually, when you look at things like noise pollution. So that's the second greatest environmental stressor after air pollution. It's associated with things like significantly poorer mental health, and areas which exceed daytime noise levels of 55 decibels are considered harmful to human health by the World Health Organization. Many, many urban areas in Europe and beyond exceed that daytime noise level. And again, we can think about this causal pathway in two different ways. So here we can think about, well, maybe vegetation helps absorb different frequencies of noise, but also that reduces noise annoyance. So one of the key things is a sort of psychological mechanism here, which is that noise is annoying, and that really influences our mental health. It really disrupts our sleep, etc., and that can go on to poorly affect our mental health. So those two kind of pathways can be linked, of course. And again, there's also this compounding pathway at play. More green space equals less room for things which generate noise. But I'm going to focus more on the causal pathway again. So I don't have time to go into all the depth here, but again, I've referred you to this really useful systematic review of the evidence on green space and noise pollution. And that provides really clear causal evidence that things like urban green roofs and green facades, so green walls, can absorb both low frequency noise through the substrates, so soil, compost, aggregates, that helps absorb low frequency noise and sound waves, and high frequency noise via plants and leaf surfaces again. So the combination of those two things, again, is really effective at buffering our exposure to low and high frequency noise. Whereas something like, let's say, just pure grassland will have that impact necessarily. So again, I'm kind of whizzing through these, but just to give you a kind of flavour of the different sort of mitigation mechanisms that might be at play. There's also two basic ways that greenery can reduce heat island effects. The most obvious one is by providing shade. So that limits our absorption, limits shortwave absorption of heat by urban surfaces by blocking sunlight, fairly obvious one. The second way is through evapotranspiration, so the evaporation of water from water bodies and soils cools the surroundings by absorbing heat as water transitions from liquid to vapour. That's evaporation. And then the transpiration is the release of that vapour directly from plants, leaves and stems, etc. So the more vegetation that you have, the higher likelihood is that you get this evapotranspiration, which cools surroundings and cools the vegetation itself. So at kind of city scale, you can think of like what we call green belts around a city, so often the green or semi-rural areas which surround a city. That can help cool cities through exactly those processes. And at the kind of micro scale, so a particular park, let's say, green space can help cool surrounding settlements as well. And just a kind of word of warning that water bodies alone, they can provide daytime cooling impacts, but they can also lead to nighttime warming impacts. So on their own, they can't produce that urban heat island effect, but they can when they're coupled with vegetation. So for example, just before I come on to that, what you might see often in the UK is a park, for example, and then the communities to the northeast of that park are benefiting from its heat mitigating capacity. And again, in the UK, that's because the prevailing wind direction is southwesterly, so often the urban heat island effects are felt more greater in communities living directly to the northeast of particular parks, in a very small buffer, so the effect quickly wears off. But those kind of communities which are immediately surrounding those green spaces are the ones which benefit from the reduced urban heat island effect. This is a particularly nice study done in London, which was looking at the association between extreme heat and mortality and the factors which might modify that association. So the black bars here are kind of worst quartiles. The grey bars are the best quartiles for all of these different kinds of factors. And what's interesting here is that NDVI, which is a satellite-derived measure of vegetation, and tree cover, were the only factors out of all of these things to impact heat-related mortality. So you might think, for example, that income might play a role, for example. So if you have a higher income, you can better buffer yourself to the impacts of extreme heat by having air conditioning or access to nice spaces which are a lot cooler. But actually that didn't modify the impact of extreme heat on mortality. I think somebody's just started sharing their own screen. Oh, okay. Is mine still showing? Can Sinaya just give me a thumbs up? Yeah. Okay. But yeah, so what they found is that all of these different socioeconomic circumstances didn't modify the association between heat and mortality, but things like tree cover and vegetation did to a statistically significant degree. So that's kind of the mitigation mechanisms. I'm going to move on then to talk about building capacities. So the idea that nature can support greater physical activity or support greater social contact. And I'll spend a bit more time talking about physical activity because that's where an awful lot of evidence has been generated in the past. So here we are on the diagram again. We're now talking about types, qualities, and availabilities of nature and how that might impact our health and well-being through the kinds of contact we have with nature and its ability to heighten physical activity or social contact. So social contact, social cohesion, social isolation, loneliness, all of these different terms have slightly different meanings to psychologists and social scientists working in this area. I'm not going to go into all the details now, but what research has found is that the duration of time we spend in natural environments for leisure and recreation predicts social contact, at least in 4 European cities in this cross-sectional study done several years ago. They didn't find the same association with land cover. So it wasn't true that people living in green areas necessarily contacted friends more often than people living in less green areas. But time spent in nature was important in this study. We also find that blue spaces are most often sought out for social contact reasons. So this was a study done by myself and colleagues. We looked at a series of motivations for visiting different kinds of natural environments. And we found that the most common motivation for visiting blue spaces, lakes, canals, rivers, seas, was for social contact. That was the main reason that people visited those spaces. And the association between visits to nature and social cohesion is a key reason that neighbourhood nature might lead to better mental health. So this was a study done by Weinstein and colleagues. They looked at the association between the green space where people lived and their mental health. And then they found a key mediating pathway was because people that lived in greener areas perceived their communities as more socially cohesive. In other words, everyone was getting along a bit better. And again, that was controlling for lots of different confounding factors. And we also find those effects for people living alone. So we did a study that just looked at people who lived on their own and not with a partner, not with children, not with anybody else. And again, what we found was that greater access to green space buffered the impact of living alone on poorer mental health. So it might be a protective factor in loneliness and social isolation as well. And also we find that when we look at reviews of interventions which aim to increase green space or improve green space, social cohesion is often the key mediator of whether they're successful or not in improving community health and well-being. So I've given an example there of a study that we did in southwest England, where we looked at improvements to a coastal park in a highly deprived urban ward over time, and we found improvements in people's satisfaction with their lives and their mental health. But those improvements were mediated by changes in the social cohesion they perceived in their community. In other words, the improvements that we made were associated with feeling that your neighbourhood was more cohesive, and that was the primary reason that we observed increases in life satisfaction and mental health. So that's just my quick run through about social contact and social cohesion. I'm just going to take you through the research on physical activity as well. The first thing that I want to say is it's not always true that greater access to green space equals greater physical activity attainment. There's actually lots of research which shows the opposite or completely equivocal associations now. However, what we do find is that things like closer proximity to green space is associated with physical activity attainment, but for only certain types of green space. As you might imagine, things like access to farmland, not associated with physical activity at all, but things like access to formal green spaces is associated with greater physical activity, things like parks, for example. So that study by Coombs was done in Bristol in the UK as well. Greater availability of green space is associated with physical activity attainment, but also we found that that was only true if you own a dog, again, in an English study here. So we found that dog ownership was a key factor that was linking availability of green space with physical activity attainment. In other words, if you live in a green area, you're more likely to own a dog. And if you're more likely to own a dog, you're more likely to be physically active because you have to walk that dog, and that means you have to do some walking too. So dogs are the ultimate public health intervention in a sense. Just being silly, but yeah. And then closer proximity to the coastline in England has also been associated with physical activity attainment. But again, there's huge regional differences here. So for example, we find that pattern in western regions of the UK, we don't find that pattern in eastern regions of the UK. Various kinds of social and environmental explanations about why that might be. And the other thing to say is that it's not all about doing adventurous things. So we did a study which looked purely at the relationship between green space and walking, probably the most accessible physical activity for a large majority of the population. And we find that walking is still a key mediator of accessibility of nature and improvements to both physical and mental health. So those relationships that I've talked about at the start of the presentation might purely be explained by people walking a bit more often and for a bit longer. So not necessarily running, cycling, or doing anything adventurous like water sports. So regardless of those various caveats, restrictions to certain types of place, to certain types of people, to certain types of area, or certain types of activity, we can still do things because we have really good data on, for example, the impacts of physical activity on different non-communicable diseases. We can start to quantify the economic impact of physical activity in nature for the relief of those kinds of non-communicable diseases. This was a study we did in 2016, where we just totaled up the total amount of physical activity, which was health enhancing, which was done in natural environments in England through leisure and recreation. And because we know what volumes of physical activity are important for reducing the risk of non-communicable diseases, and because we know how much those non-communicable diseases cost the National Health Service in this country, then we can put an economic value on how much is nature actually saving the health service or saving health and welfare savings every year, purely through physical activities, and not even accounting for all of the other benefits that nature might have. And we found that to be £2.2 billion every year. And again, we've done follow-up studies which look at the total cost savings for different kinds of non-communicable diseases. most of that reduction in savings can be attributed to improvements in reducing the risk of depression, for example, and mental health disorders. So that's an interesting way we can start to put kind of economic values on this. Oh, there we go. I forgot that was coming up. So this was the study on non-communicable disease costs. So we also find that this could substantially reduce the burden of non-communicable disease costs. So there you see major depression is contributing to reduced savings of around £92 million every year, at least in England. Okay, and then lastly, I'm going to turn to restoring capacities. So the idea that nature might help relieve us from attentional fatigue or from stressful states. I will come to some of your questions and things in a bit, so don't worry after I've talked about these mechanisms. So here again, we're talking about nature, its types, qualities, and availabilities, the kinds of contact we might have with it, how that restores us from stressful or attentionally fatigued states, and how that might feed through to better health and well-being ultimately. So some of you might have heard about this classic kind of theory in environmental psychology, which is called attention restoration theory. It's one of the kinds of areas of research which kind of drove forward lots of the epidemiologic findings I've been talking about today. The premise of this theory is that often we find ourselves with fatigued attention caused by the stresses and strains of daily life. And then environments which contain certain properties might be able to restore us from that fatigue. So the authors of this theory back in the late 80s said that environments should have extent, which means the kind of scope for feeling immersed. They must have a sense of being away, so they must not be related to your kind of everyday activities. They must have soft fascination, which means features that kind of effortlessly capture your attention rather than effortful attention. So things like rippling waves or leaves and that kind of thing. And compatibility, so the idea that environments must match your individual motivations or dispositions at that particular time. This is all quite lofty psychological speak. And the theory is that natural environments more often comprise those kinds of properties. Recovery from attentional fatigue is quicker or more complete when you're exposed to natural environments. So what's the evidence for this theory then? Well, over time there's been many primary experimental studies, and this paper here is a systematic review of all of those particular studies. And what a typical experiment might do is they might kind of stress people out cognitively by giving them a cognitively demanding task so that they're all in a kind of stressful state. Then they might measure their cognitive capacity at that time using particular kind of tests that psychologists use. Then they might assign them to randomly, let's say, walk in an urban environment or walk through a natural environment, and then they'll retest their cognitive capacity afterwards. So these are kind of artificial experiments, but they kind of demonstrate the proof of concept here, which is can you causally manipulate somebody's performance of different kinds of attention tests as a function of the environments that they visit. So this particular meta-analysis provided evidence that nature can restore attention, and that was measured through a couple of different tasks, so things like the digit span forward and backward tasks. That's where you have to memorize strings of digits in order or in reverse, and different kinds of cognitive tasks as well. But there has been some sort of debate in the literature about how much these research findings actually really represent the original theory. So people have questioned whether the tests with significant results actually demonstrate restoration of directed attention, or do they actually just represent some kind of improvement in short-term memory, let's say. There's lots of kind of criticisms and limitations with this particular body of experimental research. That's kind of attentional sort of findings. Stress findings, you might have heard of this study. It's a real kind of classic in this area of literature from Roger Ulrich and colleagues in 1984. And it kind of drove forward a lot of the research on nature and stress. And it was a really simple study, highly confounded, highly lots of limitations to it, but nonetheless it's really influential. And it was quite simple. They had 46 patients in a hospital that had had their gallbladder removed for a routine surgery. 23 of those had used food during their patient stay. 23 of them had used a brick wall. And what they found is that those with tree views have shorter post-operative stays, they have fewer negative evaluations from their nurses, and they took fewer painkillers as well. It's a real classic study, loads of problems with it, but it's kind of inspired this area of nature and stress. One of the author's conclusions was that these tree views basically help people cope with the stresses of that post-operative period. And that's what that author developed into something called the psychoevolutionary theory, or more commonly known nowadays as the stress reduction theory. And it suggests that we evolved preferences for nature based on a survival advantage. Nature provided us with fish and food and fruit and veg and lots of other things we needed to survive. And therefore, when we encounter natural stimuli, our first kind of judgment is effective. Do I like it or do I not like it? And that kind of liking or not liking is then refined through cognitive processing, and that might lead us to do certain types of behaviour. So like I said, that's now better known as the stress recovery theory or the stress reduction theory, which suggests that people are more likely to recover more quickly or more completely from stress when they're exposed to nature. And that's been evidenced through lots of things like self-reported mood scales, measures of blood pressure, measures of salivary cortisol, which I think came up in the chat a little while ago. And again, there's been systematic reviews of lots of experimental findings of this theory. They're set up in very similar ways to those attention restoration experiments. So they'll stress people out, and they'll randomly assign them to do some kind of green intervention versus some kind of urban intervention or some indoor intervention. And then they'll take sort of physiological measures before and after those things. So this particular systematic review found that the experimental conditions where people were exposed to nature were associated with decreased salivary cortisol, very small decrease but statistically significant, decreased systolic blood pressure, decreased diastolic blood pressure, decreased heart rate, and lower heart rate variability. So all of these kinds of results are consistent with physiological impacts which occur across the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. In other ways, that's the body's way of kind of regulating our response to stress. So you see the same with things like amygdala activation in the brain as well. So right from neural processes right through to the physiological expression of those neural processes in our stress pathway. Obviously, I should point out though, these are all very small numbers. They are statistically significant, but I don't know if, me personally, would I perceive my heart rate as 4 beats per minute lower than a heart rate that was 4 beats per minute higher. Whether that would meaningfully represent a decreased feeling of stress to me is another matter. So take these physiological findings with a certain pinch of salt. And what we've done recently is we've developed from that kind of stress recovery account of nature to say, well, maybe it's not just about stress recovery. Maybe nature helps disrupt the stress cycle in other ways. And we developed this theory called biopsychosocial resilience theory. And that suggests that exposure to nature not only helps us recover from stress, but it also might help us respond to it. In other words, being exposed to nature before we are exposed to a stressor might then mean that we cope with it better, because we've built up different biological, psychological, and social resources which we can deploy to better cope with those stressful responses. So that's all the kind of stuff which I've already been talking about. So if I've been exposed to nature and I've been more physically active, maybe I've got a slightly better immune system, maybe I've got a better social support network around me, and all of those things can help when I'm then confronted with a stressor. I can deploy those resources in times of stress. So it's not just about recovery, but also how I respond to stress when it does occur. And of course, we can also think of nature as disrupting stress by preventing it altogether in the first place. So if you think about things like nature-based solutions for flood risk mitigation or heat reduction, that might mean that we're not exposed to the stressor in the first place, like a flood, like an extreme heat wave event. So it stops us being exposed to stress altogether. So we developed that into this kind of meta theory, which you can look up, which describes all the different ways in which nature can prevent stress, help us respond to it, as well as help us recover from it. And that's kind of what I've got summarised on that slide here. And just to say that we're testing that through a European project called Resonate at the moment, where we're really focused on whether nature-based therapies can help us cope with and recover from different kinds of stressful states. We're doing that through a lot of different randomized controlled trials. Okay, I'm sort of running out of time because I want to have time for lots of questions at the end. So I'm just going to give you a kind of brief primer on infrastructural and social